Thanks for coming. I want to welcome very much Don Kalb, who's going to be with us for the next 3 weeks, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute. Don is a professor of social anthropology in Bergen now. Also has a position at Utrecht. Formerly was at the Central European University, and has led various commissions like the Financialization Commission of the Max Planck Institute and things of that kind. He's the author of quite a few books. Let me just read a few of them. Expanding Class, Power in Everyday Politics and Industrial Communities. Another book, Ends of Globalization, Bringing Society Back in. Later on, Critical Junctions, Anthropology and History, Beyond the Cultural Turn. A book on subtext of class, working class populism and the return of the repressed in neoliberal Europe. And most recently, one on anthropologies of class. Now, the idea of this really came out of conversations that we've been having around here, really driven by the fact that the world seems to have gone stark crazy. And it seems like that something is happening, and we ought to spend some time thinking about what's happening and how it's happening. I'm old enough to remember the peculiar years of the 1970s when we didn't know what was happening, whether it was going this way or that way or what way. And it seems we're in another of those phases right now. Ecologically, The Guardian this morning had a long piece on climate change in cities, which actually shows Miami under about 6 feet of water in about 30 years' time, unless something radical changes. Shanghai, similarly Osaka and the like. So there's an ecological problem. Economically, I would point to the sort of immense increase in indebtedness on a global scale, to the point where now the sort of global debt to GDP ratio is getting close to 250%. This was the sort of thing that in the 1970s, when Mexico got to around 70%, that called for the IMF to intervene and sort of get into austerity. But now there's this kind of crazy sort of indebtedness, and one of the issues very concerning me is the way in which debt is a claim on future labor, and it's a foreclosure of the future. And in many respects, we, as students who are also caught up in indebtedness, you know that this does indeed foreclose their future. So there's those kinds of questions. And politically, of course, all kinds of crazy mayhem is taking place. So we see the rise of very autocratic, populist kinds of administrations, Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, and also several examples in Central and Eastern Europe, and rise of alt-right and things of that kind. And we have our own wonderful example here of Donald Trump. So with all these things kind of going, it seemed it would be a good idea to have some thought together, and one of the ways to do that was to invite somebody to give a series of talks on particular kinds of questions. And those series of talks would perhaps help sharpen our minds, and at least, if not understand everything that needs to be understood, at least come up with some clarity. So Don has agreed to come here for 3 weeks to do that. So this is today the first of his talks, which is going to be about the thinking, Red October, and all that might mean for anthropology. Next Monday, on the 6th, he will be giving another talk, the capitalist transition debate, there and back again, and that will be in 9206, 9207, up on the top floor. Monday, November the 13th, the floating signifier of the global middle class, which will be in the Skylight Room, and then Monday, November the 20th, populism and dignity on left and right, and that also will be in the Skylight Room at 6:30. So I hope that people will come to the whole sequence and engage in dialogue with Don, and that we can have a real conversation. As you will see from his, as you will hear from his books, one of the questions he's very interested in is questions of class, nationalism, sovereignty, and the like. His particular interest, main center of interest, is Central and Eastern Europe and what has been happening in that part of the world. So I hope that we can enjoy these 3 weeks, and so thank you really very much for coming along and doing this. We really appreciate it, and it's much needed. So done.
Well, David gives me a big agenda that I'm not going to oblige to. But if it is true that you will be joining in a conversation over the next 3 weeks, then we might actually eat snippets of that agenda. So I hope that also very much too. Thanks a lot to David for setting this in motion. It's just great to be back here. My whole career in anthropology has been a conversation, in fact, with people who have been located at this particular institution. So I'm not one of yours, but I've been here for a long time. I could not possibly start. Oh no, let me start with this. David paints the landscape of the escalating contradictions of the present. I will be talking mainly about the past. I hope that the discussion pushes the analysis of the past and the categories that we use in doing that into dealing with the big issues of the present. I feel too humble to do that on my own and straight away. So I need you for that. And I hope you will oblige. This particular date is about, I think, 3 days before the actual centennial of the Russian Revolution. And I don't think anywhere in anthropology proper the Russian Revolution is commemorated. It will be done in historical institutes, perhaps political science, perhaps philosophy, but us anthropologists are not really with our mind in Petersburg, 1917. I've always said that is wrong, and so I could not but take this opportunity of a talk at this moment in time to grab that by the head. Now just a few words of the whole series. It was difficult to give an overall title to the series, and so I came with something that allows me to go anywhere, into the contradiction. That is a title with which I honor the former Central European University, Elkana, and I think CEU has been a very important place for me and for many people over the last 15, 20 years. I've worked there for 15 years. I helped to establish in Budapest, in the middle of Central and Eastern Europe, after the fall of the wall, a Department of Anthropology and Sociology that was very explicitly on the left, where dissertations were being written where Rosa Luxemburg or even Preobrazhensky and Trotsky came back as serious literature, as serious analyses of processes that were playing themselves out, not just in the region, but in the region as part of world history. Yehuda was the person who allowed that to happen and who stimulated that, and he would always have this fantastic bon mot when conversations were not interesting enough, that he would sort of put his fist on the table and say, I want you to go into the contradiction. And I always thought that that was very gentle and nice of him, and productive. So when I didn't know exactly how this overall title had to be, I thought, actually what I'm doing is still what Yehuda Elkanah kept telling us to do, go into the contradiction. Of course, this is contradictions. I've been working a bit on my program, and many of you know it. But let me just summarize and make the link with the title Into the Contradiction. I've been working, I think, now myself, and I wouldn't have been able 10 years ago to relate it perhaps in this way, on capitalist value regimes, on class, on struggle. I would say on really existing capitalist value regimes, and on the really existing class struggles, as complex as they are. Because class, of course, is an analytic construct, and it's not just only a lived reality or only a social category. I don't think it is a group. Class is a way to deal in a realistic form with the contradictions that are playing themselves out in the struggles and the clashes and the dynamism of capitalist value regimes. My anthropology, and I think the anthropology that sort of feels inspired by the Russian Revolution, and in particular by the intellectual ferment that went into the making of the Russian Revolution, and I'm thinking primarily of Lenin and Trotsky, and perhaps actually more about Trotsky than about Lenin, and I will talk about that in a moment, is an anthropology that is slightly less interested in meaning and morality than the regular anthropology is. It's more interested in dialectics, in struggle, relational realism, I tend to call it. It is an anthropology that deals with what actually happens in the world, the meaningful events in the world, rather than just the meaning that people say they ascribe to. I move on to talking about Red October. Now I must say again that in the phase of the revolution of 1917, I feel a little bit humble. That's only realistic. It was, of course, a huge world historical event that basically shaped the whole of the 20th century. Without October 1917, there would be no China as we know it now. There's no doubt about that. I want to say a couple of things about my general relationship to the Russian Revolution. So, first one is about Eastern Europe. And again, I just throw it in. There's a lot of debate there. Eastern Europe and communism, really existing socialism, I think, and perhaps Catherine agrees partly with me about this, that Eastern Europe didn't like the communists at all, but it did like the better periods under socialism, in particular in the 1960s and 1970s. Different moments in different of these states, but overall there was a huge part of the population that felt, in retrospect, but also in prospect, when you would have looked at, let us say, generations in the 1920s and 30s, the sort of lives that were being led under socialism in the 60s and 70s, many people thought that that was actually a rather livable sort of situation. They didn't like the communists, but they did like socialism, at least a bit. And this is absolutely part of the right-wing neo-nationalism that has been developing exactly from the moment onwards that many of these states and societies became part of the EU, from 2004 onwards. I should also say that talking about really existing socialism, I have increasingly come to the conclusion that all those who have been writing about state capitalism were right. And I'm not alone in this. There's a significant segment of left-wing intellectuals. They exist in Central and Eastern Europe. They are actually very active. There are many of them, and they're very smart, very well read, and these days also very well traveled, that have over time increasingly embraced the state capitalism thesis. The state emerged as a capital accumulation machine in Central and Eastern Europe. When you look back at the revolution, so this is a state capitalism that is not generic state capitalism. It's a state capitalism, a little bit of a Gash and Krohn variety in many ways, a state capitalism that emerged after after the Russian Revolution and after the Civil War emptied in many ways the whole area of capital. We still don't know that much about the period 1917, 1921. We do know that from 1914 to 1921, about 25 million people were killed in Russia and what became the Soviet Union. 25 million people, that's more than in the Second World War. But only 1.5 million, these are huge figures, during the First World War. So just as an idea of how tremendously ferocious the Civil War was and what that actually meant for infrastructure, for human infrastructure, for human material, as the Marxists in Central and Eastern Europe would say, has been immense. In 1922, when the new economic policy was declared, there was very little left. Production was about 50% of what the production of 1914 was. Agriculture had collapsed. There was a fierce counter-revolutionary military response from the West. Very often gets out of the picture in the estimation of the revolution. Food supplies from the West and from elsewhere in the world were cut off. In a context of famine, rather continuous famine, 3 different white armies that were approaching, well, first on Petersburg, and then when Trotsky and Lenin decided that Petersburg was simply too dangerous to stay, and they moved to the Kremlin, which was in itself a very symbolic move, because it meant making an alliance with the former Tsarist officer corps and the top bureaucracy. There was in 1922, the only existing, effective, usable organization that existed was the state, was the bureaucracy. The effort by Trotsky to open up to world trade was cut off ultimately in 1924 by the Brits and the Americans. This was a completely isolated state that had some illegal dealings, partly illegal dealings, with Germany and with Sweden, but it was completely left to its own devices. In that context, it is actually not so surprising that the state emerges as the only mechanism around which economic organization and production again begins to be run. That does not need to move into Stalinism, of course. Stalinism, in my eyes, is the counter-revolution. But state capitalism would have always been, in that particular situation, a predictable outcome in many ways. Okay, I move on. Just a couple of fast points. I'm aware, I say state capitalism, that Catherine, for example, might say, but we have always in anthropology of post-socialism has always tried to articulate that this was a significantly different civilization, run on different principles, different mechanisms. I agree with that. And if you look at the difference between the state capitalism of China and state capitalism of the Soviet Union, and in a way the state capitalism of Germany or Japan, then I think that family of phenomena that we can call state capitalism is broad enough to encompass different civilizational grammars. So I don't think the state capitalism thesis is a rejection of that sort of the anthropology of post-socialism. I think it's a further theorization, a theorization that we might not have done in the 1970s or 80s, but in retrospect it appears ever more reasonable to do that. When we commemorate the Russian Revolution, we do that also to recapture an internationalist and very capable intellectual, dialectical, intellectual, anti-capitalist practice. In particular the work of Trotsky, I would say, but also the Lenin of the development of capitalism in the countryside of the late 1890s is, and then of course the Lenin of imperialism, are very, very intelligent efforts at coming to grips with what are the crucial dynamics in that particular period of time from within the international position, and this remains essential. In many of the histories, and I will talk about the histories that are being produced at this moment to commemorate the Russian Revolution, the more right histories are very, very weakly sensitive to the fact that the Russian Revolution in that particular left was always conceived as the first step toward European revolution, to the making of a socialist United States of Europe in a literal sense, and then of the world. And it was in principle never theorized at that point in time, before 1925 or 23, as something that later became, in Stalin's terms, socialism in one country. So I want to capture the intellectual impetus of, let us say, the non-Western Marxist left in the late 19th century and the early 20th century in order to make that useful for us also in anthropology. And I will, at the tail of this talk, I will talk a little bit about how that relates to what is now sort of setting itself up as the strongest critical, radical, anti-capitalist strand in anthropology, which you might here not be so much aware of, but in Europe I'm forced to be keenly aware of that, is around the revival of the work of Marcel Mauss, in Graeber, in Keith Hart, in some others, Stradin, and around the journal How, which I think is a deeply conservative project. Okay, and then I move on again. Yeah. Now, in order to sort of secure the intellectual impetus of the late 19th century continental, non-Western left, and I say this very explicitly because when you look at the lefts in France, the intellectual lefts, in France and in England, there's a completely different trajectory there. The German and the Russian left had a very, very different experience. And it's an experience with right-wing, very concentrated, militaristic, autocratic states. Very, very sharply concentrated capital. Capital in Russia, capital in Germany, around 1910, was much more concentrated in many ways than it was, let alone in France, but even in England. And those lefts were very internationalist lefts. The left in the West was much less internationalist, was much more focused on their own national societies, the rise of labor. But the West, the intellectual left on the continent, east of France, was keenly aware of being situated in a semi-peripheral, semi-colonial situation, and was from its own position much more able than the lefts in the West. And Marcel Mauss was one of the actors in France, in any case, in the radical left, much more able to see their own situation in terms of universal history, internationalism, the international world economy, rather than in just national processes. So the internationalism of Trotsky and Lenin was entirely inscribed into the actual material histories of the Germanys of Central Europe and of Eastern Europe. Now, if we want to disconnect that body of thought, we need, of course, to separate it from the descent into brutality in Russia, in the Soviet Union, after 1917, under war communism, and then, of course, after 1925. So that means that we need to understand that from 1925 onwards, there is a counter-revolution going. It's a counter-revolution that establishes a new bourgeoisie around the bureaucracy. So it's a bourgeois revolution that's happening. It's the tenure that Trotsky was already predicting around 1925-26, and he said that explicitly in the plenum. Thermidor, he said, and his closer friends would say to him later, "You should never have said it because Stalin is never going to forgive you for this." But he was right about it. He didn't understand exactly what was happening. Later he was talking about a degenerated worker state. He didn't talk about state capitalism, but his later comrades, after his death, theorized it as state capitalism. But we need to disconnect that earlier internationalists left from the socialism in one country and the brutalities that were happening. That's also why I put so much emphasis on the Civil War and the way the West reacted to the revolution. Yes, in the Civil War it is clear that the 25 million deaths are partly produced by Trotsky's armies and by the Cheka. There are many reasons to suggest that most of the deaths have been produced by the White armies. But we don't know exactly. So if we want to save the intellectual left, we need to stand on the position that most of the killing must be from the whites. So I subscribe to that. Yeah, that's it, and I move on. Now, I want to talk a little about contemporary sort of commemorative literature that has emerged in 2017 about commemorating Russian Revolution. And I have enjoyed myself enormously in the last months reading the new literature. I wrote about the Russian Revolution and about the new economic politics as one of my first exercises in anthropology in 1980, my bachelor thesis. And then I sort of left it, but I always felt that I had to do a little bit more. So this was a really good occasion to do so. Now, when you look at the new literature, some really interesting trends emerge. And they are indicative of the sort of distance that we are developing towards the revolution and a sort of an analytical position more than a purely Cold War one. So there is this fantastic 1,000-page, more than 1,000-page book by Yuri Shleskine called The House of Government. And it focuses on these about 1,500 families that were housed in the House of Government opposite the Kremlin in the island of the Moskva River. It's a fantastic building where we actually have sat a couple of years ago. And Shleskine describes the lives of these people. Entirely relaxed. There's no ideology there. There is also no Lenin and no Trotsky there. These are very relaxed histories of what he would call a sect. He's a historian of Russia. He has worked on Jewish sects before. Here's another sect, but a very secular sect. But what is exciting is that there is no panic, no alarm. There is just an interest in utopia, real lives, banal lives. Then the way they were hit by the terror. Of course, they were decimated through the terror. The mourning. A similar sort of book is written by Mark Steinberg. Mark is a student of Charles Tilly and has worked a lot on collective protest. And Mark's book is entirely about how was the revolution experienced by common people on the street, women in the countryside, and again looking at some of the utopians and their lives. Again, a completely laid back, post-ideological, post-Cold War sort of description. So when you take these two works, you get a real feel that we are developing a big analytical and human distance against all the contestation around the Russian Revolution of the 20th century. But of course there are still right-wing versions. Sean McMeekin is a very liberal historian from Bard College. It's very interesting that this comes from Bard College. I mean, he seems to be aware of that there is a considerable left-wing segment in Bard College, and he doesn't like them. And he thinks that they are affected by the same utopian, egalitarian drive of the sect, again, that made the Russian Revolution. And he's basically writing the whole history of the Russian Revolution again to remind them, he's quite explicit about that, to remind them that this is going to be the necessary outcome. You know, large-scale violence. Very interesting that this does not come from one of these Cold War hawks, but from a historian who's really liberal. The liberals like the rise of a new left in the last 2 decades, and McMeekin's history of the Russian Revolution is clearly an expression of that. So, when in the end he asks, would Lenin have liked what he would see in 1935 under Stalin? Then his answer is immediately yes, he would have liked that. It is an automatic development. Again, it's of course the old right-wing argument, the old liberal argument. It's an automatic development from a radical revolution, egalitarian utopia, to terror. He brings it back. And then we are the Verso. Well, they are of course from a different complexion. Verso has clearly, in my eyes, coordinated the writing about the revolution, which they ought to do. We have China Miéville with a fantastic new narrative account of the revolution. It's fantastic because he's a great author. There's speed, there's humanity, there's radicalism, there's an enormous eye for detail, and it's a history of the Russian Revolution with the big ideologues, in particular Trotsky and Lenin, largely left out. That is so nice, and also in my eyes so realistic, because it shows that this is a popular rebellion, a very radical popular revolt that different actors within the left are confronted by. They try to ride the tiger, and it's only those who in the end know how to translate exactly the deeply popular impulse against the war, stop the war, and the peasant impulse to get the land, that wins. And ultimately, in the build-up of the book, it becomes entirely clear that by early October 1917, the government's gone. It's just gone. And there's no Lenin yet. There's only then the moment where Lenin decides we have to act now, and where Trotsky organizes it. Tariq Ali wrote a very, very, very intimate history, biography, in a way, intellectual biography of Lenin. And here Lenin appears as a very civilized, very friendly, very gentle, very intimate, very supportive, broadly interested person. No iron eater. Absolute opposite. And there is a lot of interest at the end of the book in Lenin's relationship with Julius Martov. Martov was an old friend of Lenin. They lived together for a long while in London. Lenin complained later that, how is it possible to live together with Martov? He comes from Odessa, from this Jewish family in Odessa, and he can just sit together in a very small house, very small room, with 15 people the whole day, and have conversations without end. And he does that day after day after day. And everything is interesting, and you listen to everything, and has an answer to everything. And Lenin said, I can't deal with this. I had to withdraw, to retreat in my own space and write. But Martov is also the person with whom Lenin has the fight in, I think it's 1903, where the Bolsheviks separate from the Mensheviks. Martov doesn't want the radical strategy that the Bolsheviks, that Lenin is pushing. Martov holds back, he has doubts, he doesn't want that. He wants to talk with people, he wants to, rather than just write and act. And then is the very significant moment, and China Miéville makes a lot of this too. So, we have the revolution, October 25. And the revolution is planned at October 25 because the state was already gone, the government was already gone basically early October. The revolution is made in 25 because on 26, the Second National Congress of the Soviets is assembling in Petersburg. And the plan is to offer the revolution to the Congress of Soviets and to give it a democratic base. The Congress of Soviets emerges in applause with great enthusiasm. They can't believe what they see. And they are very, very supportive of what's happening. And so they decide, more or less unanimously, in a vote that comprises about 800 people, 800 delegates, to support the revolution and embrace it as their own. And at that moment, Martov gets up and he says, yes, but. And the but is, we, left Mensheviks, want to be a constructive opposition. This is the day after the revolution, and everybody knows that the counter-terror will emerge soon. And the Congress basically decides, no, we don't want a constructive opposition now. We want unified standing behind the revolution. Upon which Martov says, in that case, we leave. And the whole faction leaves. And China Miéville makes the really important point that Martov has something to explain here, because at that particular moment, he leaves the heritage and the defense of the revolution entirely to the Bolsheviks. And it can, from that moment onward, not anymore develop in what we in the West might have thought of as democracy or pluralist. Now, Tariq Ali does exactly the same. Martov makes a problem, produces a problem. It's very interesting because, of course, the classic liberal histories of the Russian Revolution would have said that Lenin and Trotsky had produced a problem by taking power. The Verso authors turn that around. They say they have taken power, there was broad democratic embrace of it, but it was the left Mensheviks, and in particular, the personal antagonism, the intimate personal antagonism between Lenin and Martov that made it fall apart. Tariq Ali, too, decides that Martov has much to explain. And then he continues on in a very, very interesting anthropological mode by talking about the last months of both Lenin's and Martov's lives that are happening at the same time. Martov in Berlin, he has left the Soviet Union. Lenin has already had his second stroke and find it even difficult to talk. But he's very, very busy with Martov as a person. How is Martov doing? I want to read the old work of Martov. Martov has the same with Lenin, but they can't come together again. Zizek is the third Verso author. His book is called Lenin in 1922. There have never been Western publications about Lenin's writings in 1922. They have never been brought together in an accessible format. And here in 1922, it's the beginning of the new economic policy. The civil war is won. Blood has been spilled. The Bolsheviks look at the failing international revolution until 1921. There was the active hope that the revolution in the West would actually be happening and the connection between Berlin and Moscow would be made. The Poles have prevented that from happening. Of course, the Brits were arming the Poles. The Romanians have prevented that from happening in the south. The connection between the Budapest Commune and Russia and Moscow. These are texts that are sober and gentle and very realistic. There's no ideology there. There's even no Marxism there anymore. These are texts about the universal rules for social interaction, for example. And they put a lot of emphasis on the need to be gentle towards each other, the need to have a peasant and worker control commission above the state that should look into the dealings between the state and citizens and should have the freedom to research any excess and punish bureaucrats that make excess. A Lenin that, again, is a Lenin of intimacy and of reason and of the sort of, Western civilized behavior that many of the liberal histories of the Cold War would never have an eye for. So here is the new left-wing version emerging in 2017 of the Russian Revolution. Intimate Lenin, a revolution without ideologues, a popular revolution. Martov, who has something to explain. I want to pick up on this point, and now I move out of the Russian Revolution, and I want to talk about anthropology and Marcel Mauss, and about anti-capitalist anthropology. Now, I would suggest that Marcel Mauss is Julius Martov in many ways. As a person, Mauss produced very little. Martov also produced very little. Mauss was a cafe society person. Both laid a lot of emphasis on gentle, civilized interaction, enlightenment, and both would at the right moment fail to show political will. It's this Mauss that has now become the key symbol of an anti-capitalist anthropology. And I need to talk a little bit more about that. So, in The Gift, Mauss argues, and there's been a lot of contestation around this because The Gift is a very complex book. We all read it in anthropology, but it's not so easy to understand what is happening there. Keith Hart has argued recently, and I think with a lot of material and persuasively, that Mauss was never about the opposition between gift economies and market economies. Mauss was, and Keith Hart gets there by reading a lot of Mauss's political writings, which were entirely separated from his academic writings, and putting the academic writings in the light of the political activities and thoughts. Keith argues that The Gift is an argument that says that any society, over time and over space, has a lot of potentialities at the same time. There are gifts, there are markets, there's self-interest, there's altruism, etc. In terms of a dominant ideology, they can vary, but on the ground, this is what people are dealing with. That is sort of comprised in the Mosian concept of the total social fact, right? So any social fact sort of usurps within itself all these different aspects and potentialities. There's never just markets or market individualism or the rational actor. There's always also the moral actor. Now this concept of moral is, and in fact in French, morale, is essential for Mauss. And Mauss's socialism is very much a moral socialism, sort of moralizing that Trotsky and Lenin react against too within the Russian context. One should understand Mauss, I think, very much also within his own biography. Of course, he is the nephew of Durkheim. Both come from the area around Strasbourg, and they come from a family of entrepreneurs in embroideries. These are small capitalists, not like Friedrich Engels. Embedded in an area that was the core of the Holy Roman Empire and celebrated itself as such also between France and Germany over time. And the socialism of both Durkheim and Mauss is very much a late Holy Roman Empire socialism, paradoxically. Why is that so? It celebrates the corporations. It celebrates a state that allows its corporations, the guilds primarily, to flourish. It creates a body of law, and law and morality are the key concepts for both. It creates a body of law that allows the balancing of interests between capital and labor, between the urban patriciate and the urban poor. It is, in a sense, a socialism of the middle kingdom, an ethical socialism of universal justice. Now, I would argue that Mauss had no concept whatsoever, nor Durkheim, of course, of capitalism. If you want to understand what Mauss thinks capitalism is, or where capitalism as a set of social relationships appears in Mauss's work, then I have only found two terms that do this. That is rationalism and mercantilism, and markets, three terms. But an idea of capital, of concentrated capital that acts, and the class struggles that it produces from above, and class struggles from below by a concentrated proletariat, are absent in that vision. Now, of course, this sort of a corporatism in the European context is something that has been embraced by the European right as well as by the left, right? It's social democratic as well as Christian democratic as well as indeed fascist. Now, in Mauss's work, there is no sense of how Durkheim's theory and his own theory about gifts and his own particular sort of guild-oriented socialism that is about morale and about balances of power, how that will be appropriated in the 1920s and 30s by fascism. Mauss is completely sort of intellectually silenced in the 1930s. There's politically, he sort of withdraws. Intellectually, there's no production whatsoever. He dies after the war. He actually survives the war, but he dies unacknowledged, alone, a forgotten person. But the important thing, I think, for us to sort of remember is that the anthropology, the anti-capitalist anthropology of how, and of some of the really articulate and very productive anthropologists that celebrate Mauss and work with the work of Mauss, are just as complicit as Mauss himself in evading the possibility of actually analyzing capital. Now, Charles Tilly, in a very nice little piece with the title "Did the Cake of Custom Break?" criticized Durkheimian sociology for failing to see the two master processes of the 19th century. These are his words. And these two master processes are the concentration of coercion in the state and the concentration of capital. I totally agree with Tilly. When I look at Moos and at the contemporary work that sort of revitalizes Moos, there is no effort to actually come to grips with concentrated power and with concentrated capital and with the dialectics that sets in motion. In other words, it is an abdication of the effort to analyze what actually happens in the world. It's a moralist evasion of that. Now, the importance, of course, of commemorating the non-Western left of the late 19th century is to recapture, also within anthropology, this capacity to deal with actual history, with concentrated power, concentrated coercion, and concentrated capital. I have increasingly been impressed by Leon Trotsky. And I'm guilty. I'm aware. And I hadn't expected that. I started reading Trotsky about 3 years ago, anticipating the Russian Revolution commemoration, and I was very enchanted. And I actually realized that the way I had been writing and developing Marxism in my expanding class book, for example, was, without me knowing, very, very Trotskyian. I'm guilty. There's a couple of things that come together here, and this is all about combined and uneven development. And this is, of course, what I want to sort of glean from the intellectual ferment around the Russian Revolution as a key concept, apart from revolution itself, about class struggle. All the Marxist concepts are, of course, there, but Trotsky had this combined and uneven development. Now, I'm aware that the concept of uneven development has been celebrated by Neil in particular. I think that Neil, in the end, gave Trotsky a little bit short shrift in this little paper that he published in this commemoration of the permanent revolution. It's the other concept of Trotsky. In this commemoration in 2005 of Results and Prospects. Results and Prospects is the 100-page text that Trotsky wrote in prison in 1906. You probably all know the history. So Trotsky comes back to Russia. The Soviet was spontaneously emerging, and Trotsky gave a talk, and he was immediately voted as chairman of the Soviet, which says something about sort of charisma that he had, but also his capacity to actually listen to what was going on. Of course, the Duma is destroyed, and the Soviet is destroyed, and Trotsky is locked up. And Trotsky analyzes what happens in 1905, and he says this is a dress rehearsal for 1917. And his analysis is a very, very intellectual one, and it's very, his line of Marxism is very close to Gramsci's. He read La Briola before he read Marx. This is a very Hegelian, very humanist Marxism, which was strong also with Croce in Italy, and then sort of comes to fruition in Italy via Gramsci. Trotsky's entirely in that line, and for him, Marxism is not a sort of hovering abstract schema, hovering above the world and above world history, but it is a dialectical analysis of what's going on the street, in the world, the possibility of politics, the sentimentalities, the subjectivities, the mood, and he makes it very clear. But at the same time, he takes a step back and he says there is something very particular to Russia, and here's where combined and uneven development comes in. What is particular about Russia is how its particular set of class relationships differ from the classical Western situation. And this is all about capital. So first of all, there's a tremendously concentrated capital. So the Putilov world in Petersburg around 1900 were the largest factory in Europe. 25,000 workers, weapons production, highly skilled metal workers. Those 25,000 were housed in Viborg, concentrated around the factory. Viborg was the working class district just across the Neva from the Winter Palace and all the classic aristocratic institutions in Petersburg. This is an autocratic state, and its bourgeoisie is entirely weak. Why is it so weak? Well, partly because capital is so concentrated, you have only very, very small bourgeoisie, as compared to Germany, as compared to France, as compared to England. And capital is for more than 50% transnational. And this is the crucial issue for Trotsky. So if you look at Trotsky's text and also the history of the Russian Revolution, which I think is the sort of blueprint for China Miéville's contemporary history, then Trotsky shows immediately what it means to be entirely embedded in the world economy, and where your own mechanisms and state formation and class formation is dependent capitalism, is dependent on transnational flows of capital. When you look at permanent revolution and the history of the Russian Revolution, results and prospects, and he goes immediately into the formation of cities in Russia. The enormous waterhead that Petersburg has become because of the concentration of capital there, transnational capital, French capital in particular. Then he moves on and he analyzes the state. Yes, this is an autocracy, it's a very old autocracy, but it has become entirely dependent on international capital flows. And it's a state that takes up French loans and transforms them into a big navy, into war-making capacities, into an expanding army that needs to be aggressive on the world scene in order to pay back the loans. And so what you see in Trotsky is this very, very creative already, and so this 1906 in the prison, this very creative rethinking of the circulation of capital on a global scale and what it means for dependent capitalist locations. So the complete corruption of the state, the complete subordination of the state to the valorization of transnational portfolio capital, if you like. Now, Sean McMeekin, the liberal historian who warns us against utopian egalitarianism, recommends in retrospect that the Tsar should have never gone into war in 1914. You probably, when you follow the commemoration of the First World War, you may have seen that the mobilization of the Russian army actually sets it in motion. So the Russians, the Tsar mobilizes earlier than anybody else, and then the Germans are obliged to react to that, etc., etc. So it's now clear that the Russian reaction is quite fundamental for the sequence that produces the First World War. Now, McMeekin, as a liberal, thinks that the Tsar could have decided not to do that. But Trotsky, in 1906, already predicts that if there is an international crisis situation, the Tsar would have to play according to French interests, period. And will have his armies ready for that. And that's exactly what happened. Right. So, to wrap up, Trotsky and Lenin do what Tilly would have recommended. Analyze the concentration of coercion and analyze the concentration of capital. Understand how class mechanisms, how the dialectics operate on a world and global and on an interactive scheme. No morals, no guilds. Not just gifts and markets, but actual actors that are located deeply in the historical process. And here comes my final thing. Eric Wolf has never really talked about Trotsky. When you look at his work, Peasant Wars, then he has the chapter on Russia. I use Trotsky all the time. And in very he consents to Trotsky's analysis there. But what he does not do is acknowledge that his own lecture on power in 1991, I think, or was it 1990, published in the American Anthropologist, where he makes this distinction between four different sorts of power. Most of us use it regularly. Actually, could have been gleaned directly and explicitly from Trotsky. So Trotsky, you remember that. Eric Wolf talks about structural power, tactical power, interactional power, and willpower. Now Trotsky has slightly different words for this, but he has the same sort of schema. So Trotsky doesn't talk about power. Everything in Trotsky is about power, so it's an irrelevant concept for him in this regard, but it's about method. Trotsky says that if we want to analyze world processes and revolutionary processes, we need to analyze this on three interactive levels. And he calls the first level the algebraic level. The second level he calls the arithmetic level. And the lowest level he calls the molecular level. Now, these are 19th century science analogies, of course. He does exactly what Wolff later does. So the algebraic level is where, well, what Tilly would call the master processes of history are playing themselves out. For Trotsky, this is class formation. Trotsky, in the end, is also, here he makes, I think, his major error, because he believes that class formation is a sort of linear process over time. It's algebraic, it's covering law. And so ultimately, the working class will always emerge as a revolutionary and victorious actor. If it is not after the First World War, only in Russia, Soviet Union, but not in the West, he immediately in the 1930s predicts that if there is war again, and he sees that coming already in 1929, his analysis allows him to be very predictive and in an impressive way. Then there will be a revolution, and then the Socialist United States of Europe will be established. That's his weakness, but in general, he sets the three levels in motion in relation to each other. So the arithmetic level is where the normal day-to-day political maneuvering happens between parties within what Wolff would call organizational frames, fields of force, identifiable fields of force. So structural power for Wolff is also this sort of algebraic process. And then you have the arithmetic and organizational process within existing fields. Molecular is actually where Trotsky in the end is probably the best in his analysis. So molecular is really about the mood on the street, people, sort of things that they are inspired by, the will that they glean from this, the capacity to actually fight for a revolution rather than just make a demonstration, etc., etc. Mohs and Durkheim are methodological nationalists. They live more communities with clear boundaries, and these boundaries are national. We anthropologists can be inspired by that because it is a total social fact, and it's about morality, and it's about sensibility, it's about our subjectivities and ethical schemas. But there is a very regressive methodological nationalism happening there. It's also a very Western one. Mohs himself looked entirely down upon the rudeness of Russia as a political nation. He basically explained the brutal phases of the Russian Revolution and then the emergence of Stalin by their political incompetence, historical political incompetence, rather racist. Trotsky brings this all together in what, well, I have called as a critical junctions approach, in a global, local, dialectic sort of reasoning. So I want to leave it at this. This is what I want to glean from the East European left before the Russian Revolution, and take it, revitalize it again, and bring it into anthropology in an effort to make an anti-capitalist anthropology possible that goes beyond the mouse house.
Questions you want to?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And these could be is about the Russian Revolution, of course, or about the revolution that didn't happen in 2011 because we were too much Mao-inspired as occupied world leaders and didn't have the guts to fight. Yeah, of course, yes. I know Catherine will come at some point. Sharon.
I'll just get started.
Yes, of course.
So I think it's correct and important to note that we've talked a lot about unevenness and less about combination. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about your conception of combination and how you see that as a useful tool for looking at the political landscape on the ground today.
Yeah, very good. So let me explain a little bit further why I think that Neil is not entirely kind to Trotsky here. So Neil talks about uneven development. David also talks about uneven development. Many of us do. Uneven development is, of course, in that vision generated within a purely Marxist dialectic, right? So it's capitalism itself that produces differentiations and contradictions and uneven development. Combined and uneven development adds a particular, okay, this is probably the way to say this, adds a particular respect, analytical respect for prior histories here. So if you look at this piece that Neil Smith wrote for this collection 2005, celebrates results and prospects, Trotsky. I'm sorry, I can't generate the exact reference here now. Then Neil says, you know, why go back to Trotsky? Trotsky, combined and uneven development is a purely political notion. It's about explaining permanent revolution. And it's about explaining the Russian Revolution and revolutions in the periphery. That is true. But there is no reason whatsoever to not sort of take the analytical move that Trotsky makes there and bring it into a more universalist analysis. So I, for example, argue that, and I will do that later on, my fourth lecture, that the rise of neo-nationalism in Central and Eastern Europe, in Europe, and of course Trump and Brexit and all of this, but Central and Eastern Europe is sort of avant-garde location there, and it's really nice, interesting, analytically interesting to look into it and into its generative mechanisms in order to glean from there a set of insights that are more difficult to see in the West. I argue that this is a product of combined and uneven development. And why is that so? Because particular local histories are coming back in it. Right? So it's not just capitalist position in the world system and the contradictions of capital that generate it. They are they're 50% of it. But the particular way in which these societies reproduce over time is an amalgamation, a combination, an articulation, a critical junction between these local histories and expectations and subjectivities and the local archive of possibilities. And I say archive because these possibilities for imagining alternative futures are deeply historically embedded in the particular archive within these existing fields and these existing national societies in many ways. So in the particular way in which the contradictions of capitalism generate outcomes require a deeper interest in, let us say, anthropological histories than Neil at that point allows for. Now, I'm not saying that Neil doesn't see that. He sees that. But I don't think that from a purely sort of capital-based analysis of contradictions you get there. You see the point? And so this is where I think combined and uneven development is something that must be picked up again in very explicit ways. And I think I've been trying to do it. I know now that I've been trying to do it. I didn't see it at that point in my expanding class book, where I try to explain the particular particular culture of the south of the Netherlands, which is the most industrialized area of the Netherlands, the most concentrated sort of capital, and it has remained religious and Catholic all the time. And I explain that by the particular forms of household formation that happened there, right? So it's actual religion, and all sorts of forms of defiance are being used in the area because this is a highly dynamic capitalist area with concentrated capital. Well, the Philips Corporation emerges there, that in the end relies on the exploitation of daughters from working class families, and parents are complicit in the exploitation of these daughters. So there is a particular cultural outcome that is explained by combined and uneven development. Right? And so you have pasts, particular pasts, Catholic pasts, religious pasts, coming back in a purely modern context because the particular way the contradictions of capitalism and the class contradictions of capitalism work themselves out in place. Right? And so I think that we can actually move beyond what Neil offers us there in explicitly methodological ways.
Well, I just want to think that maybe there's a third leg of that too, which is the internationalist past.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So that's also the Trotskyist vision work, because in the Trotskyist vision, the formation of societies happen by definition within world economy. That's the start of any analysis. Is what Wolf does, what David does, right? So the contradictions of global capitalism, as they work themselves out on particular grounds, are the essential starting point. But you don't get from there into particular ways in which local histories are being picked up, restructured, revitalized, and being presented as new futures again, sometimes. Catherine.
Two things. Just briefly, your comment about state capitalism as opposed to state socialism. It seems to me that which angle of vision you take depends a little bit on your purpose. And I followed Michael Bourboy in wanting to see socialism as having its own laws of motion, because that seemed to be the best way of getting out of the sort of Cold War ideology that said, those guys are stupid and they have food lines and we have to get rid of them. So if, from your point of view, there is some significant political objective now to calling it state capitalism, I'd be interested to hear what that is.
Very nice.
So that's one question.
The
other has to do with you really opened up in an absolutely marvelous way how the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution is producing this tremendous wave of revisionist histories that are, in a sense, enabled only by the fact that the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. But you've just given us a great tour across, and I have not been reading all of these works that you refer to, but I have been I'm partway through a Romanian translation of a new history of the Russian Revolution by a Frenchman whose name I can't remember, but I'll get it to you if you want. Who, like you, is giving Trotsky the leading edge in the Russian Revolution, and he says Lenin really, just doesn't cut it. Lenin was kind of off having his strokes and not really doing doing. But this author also says that if Trotsky is responsible for most of the organizational work that produced the revolution, he's also to be seen as responsible for Stalinism. So if you take Lenin out, then Trotsky's role in producing the worst excesses of that system is foregrounded. And the last thing I want to say relative to that is that one thing this book describes, which was total news to me, is, of course, Trotsky's constantly being bounced around because he's expelled from one country or another. So he ends up spending a lot of time in the United States, in New York, and I didn't know that, where he made buddies with a lot of big money people. And when he goes back to Russia, he's communicating with these people who are In fact, Woodrow Wilson helped him get back to Russia by giving him some kind of visa that he otherwise wasn't supposed to have. So suddenly the U.S. and the big capitalists in the U.S. become tightly interconnected with the Russian Revolution in surprising ways that I think are, it's important for us to look into more.
Yeah, right. Now my political objective, and I think our political objective in Central and Eastern Europe, to talk increasingly in analytic terms about state capitalism rather than really existing socialism, I think it's very obvious. I mean, we want to liberate the possibility of socialism for the area. And as long as we fail to do that intellectually, it will be very difficult to have left-wing alternatives for the right-wing turn in the area. So there is a very clear, I think, overriding objective to do that, and much of what younger scholars in the area have been doing, I'm looking at Mary too, is opening up a capacity to sort of reappropriate, in particular, the better periods, not the Stalinist, not a criminal period, but the better periods of socialism. For re-embrace and for reappropriation in the here and now by populations that are clearly very put off by capitalist uneven and combined process. It's also a very realistic analysis. Of course, we have the work of Tony Cliff and others in, let us say, the post-Trotsky people. That was already rather intelligent work. I say now, reading it now. I didn't read it in the 1970s. Neil Davidson. I don't know whether you know the work of Neil Davidson, but Neil Davidson is a very impressive author who has come up in the last 10 years with 6 or 7 major monographs. Really, what is it? An explosion of writing on his part. He is a Scottish Trotskyist. And he certainly sort of spreads the fame of combined and uneven development around. He has, so in his big book, this 800-page book, very, very well researched, basically political philosophy, but with keen insights on, what's the title again? How revolutionary were the bourgeois revolutions? Right, so he goes actually back, and I will talk about this on Monday in the context of the transition debate towards capitalism. But Neil has picked up this state capitalist argument very, very strongly, and he has written a couple of good pieces about it. Of course, what happens under collectivization is the dispossession of the peasantry, and so you have free proletariat after that. So it's basically the enclosure movement in the Russian-Soviet situation. That newly freed up proletariat, dispossessed peasantry, is now available for accumulation for the bureaucracy and for the state capitalist mechanism. Of course, there are. I mean, it's also a socialist, right? You can perhaps use that word. It's also a socialist state capitalism, in the sense that they cannot simply take away the rights of the working class or dismiss workers easily, etc., etc. There's a lot of redistribution going on. You know better than I do, even. So it's a socialist sort of state capitalism, but the key mechanisms are state capitalist mechanisms in Neil's vision, and I think I concur with that. But again, there's an overriding political objective for liberating the possibility of socialism as a positive concept, as a concept that can sort of focus future political wills in the area from the overbearing association with Stalinism. You had 2 other questions about Trotsky. Trotsky got from the US state, and Woodrow Wilson was instrumental in that, but then he got sort of imprisoned. I don't know exactly where. Was it in Sweden or was it in Germany? And then actually the Soviet, which was after the February Revolution, 1917. I mean, the co-leading power. I mean, we still have, it just in the side, but we still have, as the definition of revolution, we have, since Tilly and many others, we still have the concept of dual power, right? But dual power is basically how Trotsky, very explicitly with the concept of dual power, analyzes the 1905 situation and then the 1917 situation. The Soviet, because Trotsky was the chair of the Soviet in 1905, Soviet intervenes with the Kerensky government, and it's only then that Trotsky is allowed to get back to Russia. So it's a complex story. McMeekin comes back with the old story that and he calls it explicitly so, that Lenin was a German operator. Yeah, you know. So this is where the liberals now are. You know, these are basically fascist stories that were circulating in 1917 in order to counter the popularity of the Bolsheviks. Of course, there is a very interesting connection between Lenin and particular operators in the German state, particularly in the Foreign Affairs Department, who were all Marxists. So there is a very complex play being played there, and of course Lenin has been facilitated into Russia at a crucial moment. But McMeekin basically says he's a German operator. Period. Mark.
First of all, I'm very sympathetic to your idea about a new embrace of socialism. But at the same time, I think that one of the failings of today's left is not to learn from the history of earlier lefts and not even to consider it a lot of times. So I thank you for your talk, which is engaging really challenging issues. You said that we don't know much about 1917 to 1921, and it was only just now in responding to Catherine's question that you even mentioned the February Revolution, which I think in some ways is almost more interesting, because the most democratic government that Russia ever had was from February to October, more or less, of 1917. And it's not, you know, you spoke of the Soviet in the singular, but what made it democratic was a huge proliferation of Soviets, of councils that existed in factories and military units and towns and neighborhoods. So there was a kind of grassroots democracy that also was very heterodox and included many parties of the left. And Bolsheviks, up until 1917, despite their name, Bolshevik were actually a minority within the Social Democratic Party. It's only sort of a little bit later in 1917 that they were genuinely Bolsheviks, a majority faction. So I think, you know, that period of the provisional government is really crucial and really interesting, particularly in light of what comes after.
Well, the point.
Democracy is not because they had a Duma or because they got rid of the monarchy. It's this grassroots phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's hugely important, and it's different than what comes after. And I think the role of Trotsky is very interesting. But Trotsky was also the commissar of the Red Army, the architect of the Red Terror, and you know, and to hang it all on the left Mensheviks and Markov cutting out at that moment, I think is a little bit...
Okay, look, I can of course play innocent. I can play innocent and say this is what the Verso books have been arguing this year, right? But I'm very sympathetic to it. I agree with that. I think Markov has a lot to explain there.
Well, but let me finish. The Bolshevik stance right around that time was first abolish all other political parties, including the left socialist revolution.
No, that is not correct.
And then they decided to abolish all factions within their own party.
Yeah, that happens.
And that's when the goose is cooked. You know,
I don't like the whole situation from, let us say, May 1918 onwards. I don't think this is a very nice situation, right? I say this, of course, with an understatement. I mean, after 4 years of war, there are another 40 years of war, 25 million dead. It's becoming really, really exciting by May 1918. There is an attack, an attentat on Lenin, as you know. There are killings going on everywhere in the country of communists, of Bolsheviki. Well, the food supply has been cut off, and there is famine. So all of this is pretty rough, really pretty rough. Now, so I'm not going to say that Trotsky was a nice, like Lenin, you know, in 1922. Trotsky was a nice, civilized, gentle man in 1918, 1921. I don't think that is the case. I think that the crackdown on the Kronstand rising is I don't even want to think of that. And when you read it in Isaac Deutscher, the Trotsky biography, then I mean he spends about 15 pages on the Kronstadt rising and the crackdown, and I mean, and he as a Trotskyist finds it very difficult to talk about. That's why it becomes 15 pages. Yeah, yes, but you know, this is in a situation of complete emergency. It's not for nothing that, and I said again, I said that the withdrawal of the seat of government to the Kremlin is just such a strong symbol in itself, right? I mean, so here you are behind the thickest walls in the whole of Eurasia and protecting yourself, and from there organizing an army that is basically based on the old Tsarist core. So what you are getting, I mean, it's really interesting to think about that also in internationalist terms. So what Trotsky actually produces, and of course we must have respect for our charismatic organizational capacities of pulling an army out of the ground at that point to defend a socialist republic. You get the opposite of what happens in Berlin, right? So in Berlin, you see that social democrats, after the Spartacus Rising in early 1919, aligned with the former officer corps of the Kaiser and cracked down on the communists, which is the cradle of the rise of fascism in Germany, as you know. In Russia, it's exactly the other way around. Here the officers align with a Red Republic. But that from that moment onward, it becomes a different sort of republic. And so, you know, Trotsky becomes, of course, the organizer of that. But this army is, of course, a red army, but it's not a revolutionary army. It's a bloody army. So yeah, I mean, what can we say? I mean, as I said, I've become very humble in that sort of a situation. It's famine, it's dog, complete social collapse. Yes, Trotsky was lightly criminal, I think. But it's only in the course of that process that other parties become outlawed. Also, even very explicitly in Terrorism and Communism, 1921, the book in which Trotsky explains his policy around the Red Army and the emergence of Red Terror as an explicit concept. He's very explicit that this is in response to the Civil War, to the rise of the White Armies. The White Armies use the old pogrom techniques, as you probably know, right? So the Denikin army organizes pogroms while it is advancing, and so in the middle of 1918, you have immediately 150,000 killings as a pogrom before the White Army actually arrives in places in Central Russia. It's a dramatic situation. And again, we don't know so much about it. There's not something like very objective research that shows what the Red Army does and what the White Armies do. But Mikin says both is all war communism. It's the cruelty of war communism. But war communism is in the end, as Trotsky himself explains, and I tend to believe that, an effort to keep a little bit of fruit going to the cities, right? Petersburg is in October 1917 a city of 4 million inhabitants. By 1921, it is a city of 1.5 million inhabitants. Right? Just to give an indication of the complete deurbanization that takes place in these years as a consequence of famine. So, I'm too humble for that. I can't judge this, but I'm completely ready to accept that Trotsky has blood on his hands. Jerry.
I want to ask you a conceptual question. On the one hand, you describe this utterly brutal, massive, chaotic, whatever, Russian Revolution, 25 million people dead. And on the other hand, you wind up celebrating as coming out of it, and what I regard as an artificially coherent concept of combined and uneven development. It exists, it's there, blah, blah, blah. But instead of a concept like combined and chaotic development, which seems to make much more sense both of what the relationship between capitalist states and their hinterlands and the capitalist state itself. So, if you, ultimately, I'm trying to push you in a direction, if you did, I felt listening to your paper as really as excellent as it was, and as impressive as it was, that we're back in the days of Edward Said, trapped in a European anthropology, rooted in a European history. And if you look at partial, incomplete, failed, even more chaotic Jamaica, South Africa, etc., etc., if you look at those semi-revolutions, as it were, you couldn't come out celebrating combined and uneven development because it hides the chaos both of capitalism and its relations to its interest.
I mean, in a moral sense, or in a human sense, I completely embrace what you were saying. But, we are here, and Trotsky was there, to make analytic sense of what is happening, and to sort of analyze and potentially somehow predict a set of developments that are taking place. So if you say this is combined and uneven chaos, then you leave yourself up for complete contingency. And I don't think that is where the left has
Or
to
a
go.
new revolution.
Well, yeah. Well, that might be a very bloody revolution too, then.
Why not?
Yeah. Well, I have always liked a lot your capacity to analyze contradictions as producing the ultimate chaos of people's lives. I like that a lot. And I think it is certainly something that must be brought in here. It's probably part of combined and uneven development that this chaos is going. But in terms of analyzing it and trying to design concepts that allow us to become political about it, it can't be pure contingency, it can't be chaos. So I always talk about structured contingencies in this, and I think again that this is sort of loyal to Trotsky in retrospect. Structured in the sense that here are identifiable mechanisms, antagonisms, dialectics going with actors that we can identify, give a name, that have particular interests and drives, and that ultimately together produce particular societal outcomes over time. Of course, there's always contingency because there is events, there are prior histories, things come together in ways they cannot entirely anticipate. But to immediately sort of throw my hands in the air and say this must be chaos is, I think, not good for us.
Except that the concept of chaos gets us closer to the lives that people actually lead in the midst of it.
Yes, that is something I completely agree with. Yeah. No.
Thanks very much, very interesting.
You're sitting there all the time?
I was hiding it. Two things. I wonder if you talk about the East and the Eastern intellect. If one doesn't have to go further east to China, right? And look at the Chinese experience of it, including now. And how do you understand that in terms of state capitalism, state socialism, especially in light of what seems to be being interpreted in the Western press as a move away from the market to the state in the recent Chinese Party Congress. And this is a big disappointment. A lot of people think the market direction seems to be going back in the state direction. Xi Jinping is blah, blah, blah. That's one thing. I wanted to ask you a second thing, as you spoke a lot about critiquing methodological nationalism on the left, in form of Sarkozy and stuff. Where are the methodological internationalists hiding? I mean, where are they to be found is what I want to ask you. I mean,
Do you feel alone?
I don't know. I think both of us seem to be alone. I mean, I'm partly, I'm perhaps more serious. When I read the analysis coming from the left, and they're very nationalist. They're very, people critique globalization, not the neoliberal component of it, but the international component of it. So the problem many of the left seem to have with globalization, right, is that it's global, right? Not that it is neoliberal. So I'm curious to know if you've found this left of which you speak, or if you can help us to find it.
Well, you understand that it's not for nothing that I'm making the argument about China. Well, yeah, but aren't these pendulum swings within Chinese state capitalism, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, right? It seems to me that these are relatively rational, well implemented, in some ways perhaps a little bit ruthless too, in terms of its, domestic repression, which is not something that is, let us say, very much out on the street in China, but of course it hits particular actors within the system. Overall, this to me just a pendulum swift. There was a really good article, I think, by Martin Wolf the other day in Financial Times that said, look at how well China has managed as compared to the West, Trump and all that. We're falling apart. We're literally falling apart. Now everybody's, of course, economically we're doing well finally after so many years, which seems to me very superficial and basically, magnifying and accelerating a set of perverse trends that have been happening over the last 20, 25 years. So you can only sort of get into a larger contradiction. But China is managing its contradictions, I would say, impressively competently.
But it does raise the problem of Margaret, that there's the contradiction between liberal democracy and revolutionary transformation is a deep and profound one, and seems, despite, Lenin was a pleasant fellow, and I'm sure Trotsky was even more pleasant fellow. But apart from this personality thing, when you look at the Chinese case, setting aside, I think this question of terror may be an obstacle to analyzing it in a way.
I think so too.
Because the issue of the absence of liberal democracy goes beyond terror. In fact, the Chinese thing, for the reason, is spectacularly free of terror in that sense. Right? And it's very pleasant to live where people tell them just keep hold your corner and So that but the institutional structure is obviously not, and the way it operates is obviously not democratic in any meaningful sense. So the Chinese case seems to suggest that there's really a much deeper antagonism between what people in this room would accept as democracy. And this transformation of society, it almost seems to lead to the view that it's an inescapable situation, that if you go down this road, you may not have terror. This is why I would bracket the terror, because to me, that's not the core of the issue. I mean, of course. But the institutional structure which emerges from the process is what I was getting at.
Yeah.
It's not what people would recognize as a democratic institutional structure. And this seems to me to be something which has to be analyzed and confronted, and it's difficult to.
Yeah.
Well, this is what I meant by the Chinese thing, really, because it's stable, it's beautifully managed, it's more better than Google. Their Google is better than our Google. Their Facebook is better. It's all of these marvelous things.
Their pollution is too.
Well, their trades are marvelous, and they're getting rid of pollution at a dramatic rate.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question about
Ecological civilization. That's where they
and the environmental money being in. All of these things. I think the interesting thing about China is not that it's polluted and so on and so on. The interesting thing about China is the Martin Wolf point, that the thing is unfolding as a sort of bourgeois paradise in a way, with Chinese characteristics.
Yeah. Well, I agree so much. But at the same time, shouldn't we also turn this back? I mean, how democratic are our situations? How democratic is the US state at this moment? How democratic is the European Union?
Indeed.
Not, right? It's not democratic. There has been very, very close historical association, not between democracy and capitalism, but between liberalism and capitalism. That is not, let us say, so humanistic in itself either. So I find it, perhaps as a Marxist, I have probably to admit a certain blind spot there. While I'm entirely in favor of very democratic structures and democratic life, I am, I think, a bit weak in analyzing it. And it's also because it's a flawed signifier, that democratic. We have our own concept of democracy has been so thoroughly corrupted that it becomes even difficult to analyze our own situation and to use it to intervene or to understand the Chinese case. Humbleness? I don't know. I can't entirely deal with it. But of course I'm aware this is not a democratic state, China. But it has in any case a relatively competent ruling class. It's not what we can say. And I am just so happy that these big German cars are now finally pushed off the market by a combination of, American venture capital, Tesla, and the Chinese market. It's just one thing. What can I say?
Any other questions?
There's one more.
Okay.
Yeah, one more thing. I just to pick up on that last point that Don made about the methodological national.
Oh yeah, I didn't even answer.
Yeah, so I'll add to that because
Right.
I had a very similar question, concern. I love the critique of the neo-Mosians and their methodological nationalism, but it did beg the question about the methodological nationalism of the Marxist left, and where we can find, there's a way in which we all affirm it, and yet when it comes down to those internationalist moments, it seems like we don't have good resources either in Marxism or frankly in anthropology. So part of the problem with the Howe group, I would suggest, is not only because they were social democrats, but perhaps their anthropology has as much to do with the kind of difficulty in thinking those political intersections as their limited political imagination or economic analysis. So I just wonder, I want to affirm Don's question and ask where you look for those resources, see them, feel them. I feel like we're in a moment in critical theory, post-colonial studies, Marxism, where we don't know how to think that. So this is a way of affirming your project of putting the internationalism back in this anti-capitalist anthropology by looking to these predecessors.
Yeah, great. Thanks for bringing it back, and sorry, Don, for not immediately answering that. Well, it seems to me that we have actually regressed a lot as compared to about 20 years ago. Right? So in 1999 and the rise of the auto-globalist movement was a fantastic internationalization of the perspective. Of course, it was in an entire repudiation of the Soviet heritage and of the Russian Revolution, which I always thought was its weakness too at the same time. But of course, between 1999 and the slow death after 2003 of the auto-globalist movement, we did have a very left-wing internationalist moment, which ranks probably second after the 1965, 1980 leftist internationalist moment. It's very interesting to see, so just in analytic terms, that 2011 and the new mobilizations against austerity and debt have cut that internationalism of the auto-globalists and have completely sort of closed the international loop again, and we all become completely concentrated on processes in our national societies again, partly because it is about, in Europe in any case, in Southern Europe in any case, it's about trying to save the national welfare state. I mean, we're standing so much with our back against the wall that we're even becoming methodological and political nationalists within the left, in order to save just the little bits of what the welfare state ever had to offer. So I think in the light of those processes, we should understand why this internationalist left is collapsing. At the same time, I don't think that intellectually it is done. I mean, intellectually, we haven't perhaps gotten so many new impulses since 2008, 2011, but we're not bad.
Okay, maybe we should leave it there, and hope to see you. And, remember, on Monday we will be another round.